Good afternoon. Just checking the participation list. We only have a few people in at the moment, so hopefully we'll get a few more. I'm not sure if it's advertised it's starting at 12:30 rather than 12:15. That may be it. But welcome to those of you who are here for the second of. Let me just adjust my camera. The second of our online CPD sessions of the new school year, and the second time we've run this today. So. We had the pleasure of this morning of Dr. Emma Kell, and she's back again with us. We ran these webinars for a couple of months at the end of last school year. We're really grateful for the feedback we get on them. We hope they're useful to you. Do let us know if they are, or indeed if they're not. We're planning to run webinars most Tuesday mornings between now and the Christmas break. So we hope we've got an exciting programme lined up for you. This week we're covering resilience and wellbeing with Dr. Emma Kell, who's there on my what's that left, I suppose. Dr. Emma is an associate of the Education Support Partnership, and she will be presenting the full version of this training as a course next Thursday, 24th of September. Dr. Emma has over 20 years experience as a teacher and a leader at both middle and senior level, and she's a specialist leader of education. She's a senior teaching fellow at UCL's Institute of Education, and a teaching school lead role for Aspire AP, which is a pupil referral unit in Buckinghamshire. Emma speaks regularly on wellbeing, recruitment, retention and rights for TES, BBC Teach and other publications in the news agent near you. Sorry, can't speak. She's written How to Survive in Teaching and A Little Guide for Teachers, Wellbeing and Self-Care, and is working or has completed a doctorate on teaching wellbeing and work-life balance at Middlesex University. So our aim today is to help provide a practical session to underpin the contemporary research realities around wellbeing, both for leaders and their colleagues in the school leadership team. We'll be looking at a series of models which can be used with staff to help promote positive practices, and we hope ultimately keep great leaders and teachers happily in the profession. I'll let Emma off the leash in a minute to run through the presentation, but just a couple of housekeeping things, if I may. First to say, we recorded this morning's session, recording this one as well. We'll put one of those out to attendees and possibly on YouTube later on, and we have the slides as well, which we'll send around to delegates. So you don't need to take copious notes, and you can share those with your senior leadership team. Your name will appear on the screen. We ran this morning as a fairly interactive session using the chat function and the Q&A function, both of which are at the bottom of your screen there. If you move your cursor, you'll probably see them. Because we've got a small audience, we'll probably be able to unmute people and have it more interactive that way. Let's see how we get on. And Emma will happily take questions as we go through, I guess. And at the end, we'll have a quick poll. So if you can happily fill that in, we'll know what to do and what not to do for next time. That's probably all I need to say, and I'll hand you over to Dr. Emma to run through her presentation.
Hi everybody, thank you for taking time to be here out of what is undoubtedly a hugely challenging day, week, month, year. Really appreciate it. I am now going to share my screen. I'm going to switch my camera off because there's nothing worse than staring at yourself for an hour. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, right. Okay, so I'm here on behalf of the Education Support Partnership, as Andy indicated. I'm very proud to work as an associate for them alongside my various other ventures. I'm very proud to have been a teacher for 20 years, and Andy went through all of those other things I do as well. I'm absolutely passionate about teacher wellbeing, about the idea that we are indeed human beings first and teachers, leaders second of all. So here you go. Here are the aims of the session. Now, there's nothing worse than people reading to you, so I will let you read those yourself. Right, so the key things to emphasize here is that this is a whiz through. This is a much shorter session than we would usually have, but I want to strike that balance between giving you the breadth of material and a sense of how it can be used in school and going into depth, which we will do on that second session. The key thing that I am going to ask you to do, though, at the end of this session is to make a pledge to yourself. And that is specifically to yourself, to look after yourself first, something very specific that you are going to start doing or keep doing in order to keep your own seatbelt done up or oxygen mask filled up, or however you want to put it. So, brief overview of the difference between the session we're doing today and the session we will do on the 24th of September is here. Again, I won't read it to you, but the key thing is that you're going to get some practical research-based models today, a short chance to reflect. You're going to get an overview of how you can support well-being and a chance to look at an activity, which we will do in detail on the 24th and which you can do with your groups. On the 24th, the key thing is that, lovely as it is for you to sit and listen to me, actually the interaction between you is where the real power of these sessions comes in. And obviously, under normal circumstances, I would be in a room with you and able to see the whites of your eyes and tell whether you're laughing at my jokes or not, and I can't do that. But we will find a way on the 24th of giving you a chance to actually actively network, interact with one another. And the key thing for the 24th as well is, obviously, well-being is never one size fits all. No two contexts are the same, so really thinking in depth about your unique context. The one other key thing I wanted to highlight is that your feedback on this session is key, because as I said to Andy earlier, I can talk about this stuff all day, and I've written quite extensively about it, lots and lots of practical stuff. So we can talk about things like managing workload and agency and so on, but what I will do is I will shape that existing session around your requirements. So introduction. So at this stage, and I'm going to ask you to do this, we would normally ask everybody to introduce themselves briefly. And just in the chat bar, if you could share with us what your major well-being challenge is at the moment in your school context. And then a win, something that you are already doing, that you are determined to keep doing, that works well. And the example I always use, it seems so basic, but where I work at Aspire AP in Buckinghamshire, whenever you visit one of the school sites, we've got about 6 sites, you get offered a cup of tea or coffee by a student, by a member of staff, whoever it is. And the first 3 times I thought this was mere coincidence, and I've learned actually that it is part of the wellbeing charter, it's part of the wellbeing policy, that whenever anyone enters a building, they are offered a cup of tea or coffee. Such a small thing, but the small things are really important. So can I give you now just a couple of minutes, and as I said, this is a romp through, to just share on the chat bar what's worrying you the most at the moment from a wellbeing point of view in a professional context, and what your key wellbeing wins are at the moment. So Andy's challenge is not to get depressed at the thought of going into full lockdown. We had about 30 people this morning, and a lot of people extremely worried about the implications of a second spike or of partial lockdowns. You know, we know that the reality is that there are positive tests coming up. We've got one just 2 miles down the road here. What are the implications of those? The other thing, full transparency, I am stuck at home with my children at the moment. They'd just gone back to school, and then one of them got a cold temperature yesterday, and now we are stuck in the cycle of trying to get a COVID test, which, trust me, I have refreshed that site now about 5,000 times, and you must have staff stuck at home, children stuck at home, having just got back into routine. Challenge trying to support parents bringing their children into school. Yes, of course, because, and I'll talk about this later, you know, the experiences of lockdown, the fear, the anxiety around this new routine is huge. And we know that a lot of children actually were much happier during lockdown, you know, for all the alarmism that's been around. The implications of ongoing blended learning, fewer meetings is a win. Waiting for where someone here is also waiting for their results. At least you've got a test, Mrs. Swan. If you've got any secrets to get a test, please let me know. Worrying about stuff, of course, and you're not there. And there's nothing like being there, but there's also nothing you can do, and it's that issue of control, which we'll come back to later. Now, I'm going to minimize that now, but leave it running. And we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of schools. So in the full session, we'll get people to go off and think about what is unique and extraordinary about schools compared to other professions. Now, that is not to say, and this is a trap that we easily fall into as teachers, I know I do, not to say that teaching is the only hard job in the world. Working in a school is not the only hard job in the world. There are many very, very demanding jobs. But schools are quite bizarre. Schools are quite unique places. So what we do is we get people to talk to us about what is it about schools that are different to other workplaces. So let's think about office work, let's think about journalism, let's think about NHS work, all those different jobs. And what is it that is unique, different, extraordinary about teaching? And these are some of the things that people come up with. So this bit's divided into two sections because, of course, normally we talk about ordinary times, whether there will be such a thing as ordinary times again, who knows? But in ordinary times, so pre-COVID times, and still, these are some of the things that make schools extraordinary. Firstly, the working within a timetable. So there's extremely rigid timetables, which we live by. And you speak to teachers well into retirement, and they still think of 10:27 as the packing up time and 10:52 as the time when they have to choose between having a wee and having a cup of tea. So that adrenalized environment of the timetable means that we are constantly working in almost microseconds, microminutes, hyper aware of time. Secondly, the structure of the school year. Now, this is going to sound weird, but I had never thought about this until I sat down to do this research with education support, that actually the nature of the school year, and we'll talk about this a bit more later in the context of an activity or a proposed activity, is such that we are all energized. We've all had a holiday at the same time. We all come back, hopefully, most of us at least, relatively full of energy in September. And we have a tendency to, if you're anything like me, hit the ground running, overwork in those first 2, 3, 4 weeks of September, and then find ourselves wondering when on earth half term is, and looking at the clock and finding out it's only the 12th of September. And then, of course, there are those months in November, December, where everyone is completely and utterly knackered, and it's unique in that in other jobs people can take annual leave, and they can take annual leave whenever they like. And so when you send that email to somebody working in an office, you'll get the auto response saying they're not in, and they really won't be in for that time. That's another thing teachers do. You know, we check in, don't we? We check in over the weekend, we check in at 2 a.m. just to check everything's okay. So that structure of the school year is quite rigid. It's quite cyclic, and it means that we are all going through the same things at the same time, which offers unique opportunities, but also some really unique challenges. Thirdly, and this is even worse now, of course, because of bubbles, but the inaccessibility of staff. So we think of teaching as being a very sociable, very people-oriented profession, and it is, of course it is. But actually, when we analyse it, the research suggests that actually 80% of staff are inaccessible to other staff for 80% of the time. So in practice, that means that all that really important business of knowing what the priorities are, sharing the ethos, sharing the risk assessments, all of these things have to be communicated in very squashed, very intensive periods of time. This means that meetings can feel very arduous. You get that information overload feeling of just having to feed yourself with information without that time for what my coach calls staring at the wall time and reflection and thinking. And it means we get those rushed conversations in corridors of, did you get my email, which can come across as terse or unfriendly if we're not very careful. And thirdly, the number and quality of relationships within a school. Now, you as heads, of course, will have been in school as much as you possibly can since March. In fact, I fully appreciate that actually you haven't stopped since March, almost certainly. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but you know, the number of announcements coming in very late, and meaning you've had to work over Easter holidays, bank holiday weekends, and so on. But many of us have actually been stuck at home in frustrating circumstances, but relatively quiet circumstances. My life has become a lot quieter, and then you get back into school on a full timetable, and actually, you know, there's some of the research says that actually teachers make 1,500 decisions a day. Now, I'm really interested in a piece of research project which looks at the number of interactions we have a day, because you think everything from the casual look to the smile, to the walking past someone in a corridor, it's got to be in the tens of thousands. It's really intense. And what can happen, of course, is that we're like what was it? We're like Velcro for the negative and Teflon for the positive. So we have so many rich, meaningful, productive interactions, and then one parent makes one complaint about the way they were greeted at the school gate, and that can really ruin somebody's day. So those really intensive interactions are absolutely key to life in a school. And then there's the vocational element of teaching. And this is something I come back to again and again and again. Nobody comes into teaching to do a bad job. Nobody comes to work anywhere to do a bad job. And sometimes I worry about the deficit model, which looks at every teacher as inherently in need of fixing. Actually, nobody wants to do a bad job. People are in the job because they want to make a difference to young people's lives, because they want to share a passion for their subject. And that does mean that it's a profession that attracts perfectionists. And we know there's then that tension, because this is a job that's never finished, it's never done. It's not something that you can leave at the office. So my husband's a journalist, he's gone to do a story today, he'll be back this evening, that story will be done, dusted, sent off, sent into the editing studio, and then he can completely forget about it. In this job, because it is about human beings, we can't ever forget about it. And we do often get people who will regularly be their own worst enemy and go above and beyond, to the point where they put their own well-being at risk. And then just briefly, and again, this is something that we would now spend time in the longer session, getting people to really reflect on their unique circumstances and the unique challenges of their context. So a school in Brent, for example, that I know very well, has been really badly hit by mortality as a result of COVID. Other schools have found it much harder to reach certain students. There are students that may not even be back by now. They don't know what they've been through. So just thinking about those extraordinary times, those experiences of lockdown, for staff and students, which we will probably never know. And while some people may have, learnt conversational Swedish and picked up the banjo and done a marathon while they were away, many others have been dealing with all sorts of emotional, financial burdens and anxieties that we can't reach. And I think we're used to being in touch with people. We're used to being able to see the whites of their eyes. We're used to being able to sniff our students to check that they're well looked after and well washed. And there are some things for both students and staff that we will never know. The guidance and responses, I've alluded to this, but no doubt the NAHT has a position on this, but we were promised decent testing procedures, and I have heard from hundreds of schools, teachers, professionals in the last 24 hours who are literally stuck at home and desperate to get to work. And it's a farce and it's a scandal. And it's so frustrating, because we're primed to go. We've just got these kids back into some kind of routine. So ways of living, people have got used to a very different pace. They've got used to living in very different ways, getting people back in to that school life, but without being tempted to just go back to how we did things before. It's that idea of grasping this opportunity, of seeing the world in a completely different way in all its vulnerability, and saying, well, actually, how can we do things differently? The art of the possible, as one of my colleagues calls it. The prospect of a second spike is obviously dominating everybody's thoughts at the moment, and we'll talk about control in a minute. It's completely out of our control. We just don't know. We can only do what we can do. We can only make the wisest decisions for our staff with regard to masks, with regards to bubbles, with regard to sickness, absence. We can only do our very best. And just thinking about, how people will cope if we're plunged into a second spike. And I have to say, in all transparency here, that I am really worried for many of my head teacher colleagues at the moment, that the relentless pressures that you have faced over recent months, combined with the relative lack of support from society, from government, from the media, is a really, really toxic mix. So we've got all of these different pressures going on, which are inevitably having an impact on our well-being and on our sense of self-efficacy in our jobs. So we're going to move on now. If you could make sure you've got a pen and a piece of paper to hand, we're going to do a short activity. So in the full session, we'll spend a lot more time dwelling on your own context on these activities, spending time thinking about yourselves and your staff and the people you work with in your school context. But we are going to do a short activity in just a moment. This model is probably my favorite, in the sense that I find myself coming back to it again and again and again in work and indeed in life. And actually the test of these sessions in a way for me is that they're not actually for educators, they're just for people. People dealing with pressures, but tailored obviously to education, you'll be relieved to hear. So these are Stephen Covey's circles of influence and circles of concern, and you will have seen this before. And again, it's worth just highlighting that none of this is new, none of this is rocket science. This session and its longer version are really a chance to give yourself permission to put yourself first. As Andy Hammond said in the introduction session, you know, that's not self-indulgence. Permission to actually fill up your own tank, because the best, the most effective teachers and leaders are the ones who are looking after themselves the best. And we know that, but we are notoriously not always very good at it. So the inner circle, the orange circle, is your circle of influence. So these are the things in your life, in your work, that are really, really important, and that you do have control over, even though you might not always feel as if you do. So these are the smallest things, excuse me, these are the smallest things, from what you eat for breakfast, whether you eat breakfast, whether you take your breakfast to work and make sure that someone holds you to account for eating it there. I was working with a head teacher the other day whose breakfast was still there at 4 o'clock when we left. It's like, so next week I'm going to make sure you eat it. The small things like what you wear in the morning, what you choose to wear, and also the things that can seem a little bit more ambiguous, like the way you speak to people, whether you actually say good morning, where and when you have those difficult conversations, where you put, and obviously all of these different things you've had to put in place, where you put your sanitizing materials, how you communicate to staff, how those have to be used. So the bigger that circle of influence, the better, simply put, the better your sense of self-efficacy and well-being and resilience. The circle of concern are, of course, those things that are really important that we cannot control. So a second spike, we just don't know. Another one that's worth highlighting there, which many, so I work with head teachers across Buckinghamshire, and I regularly consult with them on wellbeing and also strategic developments. And one of the things that comes back actually from staff is that many of them are very concerned about how well other staff are adhering to health and safety, sanitizing, masks, or whatever your policy is, because many people have been really, really, really careful now for 7 months now, and are really quite worried about how well others are looking after themselves. So I'd like you now to draw 2 concentric circles, please. In the inner circle, I would like you to jot down all of the things in your life which are really important, your life and work, which you do have an element of control over. So it could be what you eat, what you wear, how you talk, anything that you can think of, how you travel, whether you book a holiday, well, that's a sore spot actually, whether you book some time with friends, there you go. And then your circle of concern is all of the things that are currently concerning you, taking up your brain power and your emotional energy that you cannot control. So can you just spend, let's say, 3 minutes doing that now? And again, this is something we would dwell on quite a lot in the longer session. I'm going to move things along now because I'm conscious of your precious time and the fact that we do have a longer session coming up on the 24th. But this is a really powerful activity that you might wish to do as a private activity. You could ask depending on your teams and the nature of the relationships, to do those together and share some of those things. And the key thing in the full session is that we talk about strategies for moving elements of life that are in that circle of concern into that circle of influence. And these are some of the key questions that we'll explore in the full session, of things that you're trying to control that you're not in control of. So that more often than not is other people's agendas, other people's perceptions that with the best will in the world, we can never know. What you do have more influence over than you realize. The subtitle for the recent book I've written on wellbeing with Adrian Bethune could almost be, you have more control than you think you do. And what you could practically be doing, and we'll go into those strategies in a lot more detail, and therefore what you need to prioritize. And there's a whole section on workload, which we can include for you on the 24th as well, which talks about priority and managing workload. In this section, I'm just going to swap these next two around. So in this section, I want to talk about stress. So we are all too familiar with stress. Stress does not always have to be a terrible thing. So there is such a thing as good stress. And again, we would discuss that at this point. I would ideally be in a room with you, and we'd talk about some of the types of good stress in life. So let's imagine life without deadlines, life without adrenaline, life without any pressure. Well, it would all become a bit flabby and a bit boring, frankly, and we maybe lose that sense of vocation, sense of purpose. So we need deadlines. So when you went to your interview for the headship, which you currently hold, you will, unless you're superhuman, have felt quite stressed about it, and that stress will have channeled itself into focus, into adrenaline, and will have got you ultimately that job. There are other kinds of good stress, and the good stress of the one I always use with my students when they go off into their AQA English exam is, off you go and enjoy it. Enjoy this exam because you have learned so much and now is your chance to shine. So the stress of an exam, which can work for some people, not all. The stress of packing to go on holiday when nobody's speaking to each other, or maybe that's just my family, but nobody's speaking to each other, you're just about to leave the house, but it's a good thing because you're going on holiday. And then there's the bad stress, which we all experience. It's inescapable in life, and it's particularly inescapable in teaching. And if you do have a look at the education support partnerships wellbeing index from last year, they run it every year. Bad stress is a significant feature, particularly interestingly for school leaders, who are some of the most vulnerable when it comes to wellbeing. So bad stress, that's the one that actually starts to create symptoms. So it can be headaches, it can be a bad back, it can be insomnia. I was going to say amnesia, actually amnesia as well. Yeah, there's another one. So an inability to sleep, waking up very early in the morning. Somebody said earlier they get that one. And it can also lead to those compensating behaviors. So not eating enough, failing to go to the toilet often enough, and not necessarily because you don't have time, but because you're not making time to eat and drink, which is very common actually. And those habits we have that we know we should all be running couch to 5K. We know that a bottle of wine a night isn't good for us. We know these things, but we fall sometimes into these compensating behaviors, and yet we still manage to keep functioning. We keep going. We keep appearing as if everything is okay. And then there's that acute stress, that ugly stress. Now, this is where it starts to get dark and it starts to get dangerous. And I think probably we all know people who've fallen into this, sometimes with the most tragic consequences of loss of life or loss to the profession of some of our most principled and amazing people. And I'm sure you are too. I'm thinking of certain people here that the profession shouldn't have lost and did due to ugly stress. And this is the ugly stress which actually causes severe health problems. Now, there's some research I'd like to cite here, which again, I'll go into in more depth in the full session, but this is the Global City Leaders research from UCL, University College London, led by Dr. Karen Edge. And what they did was they are ongoing. They are researching Generation X leaders from the US and Canada. And they look at these leaders who've actually fallen into this ugly stress, who've actually ceased to be able to work, to function, and look at some of the most extreme situations. In one case, someone having their last rites read in hospital because they genuinely believed, and the doctors believed, they were going to die because they had allowed their body to get to such a state because of stress. And what they did was they looked at these people and they realized that actually they had completely failed to attend, completely neglected, I suppose is the word, to attend to their most basic needs. And we know this, that the more tired we get, the harder it gets to say no. So I've been really lucky in my career, but I had one annus horribilis, one really horrible year. And you may have noticed, don't stop talking. And I just stopped talking. And I stopped communicating, and I stopped. My relationships suffered. My relationship with my children suffered because I never saw them, and it actually started to get really quite dangerous. So this is about looking out for ourselves, looking out for each other, and using those support networks like education support for early intervention, not waiting till it gets ugly. Looking out for it in others, making sure that there is a staff mental health policy, so that we know that when people start to fall into this, we've got their backs. Because we all know how it feels. And then there's a reflection activity here, which I think we will stop and do very briefly because I'm conscious of time. This is the idea of the well-being tells, which also comes from the Global City Leaders research. And this is how we behave when we're starting to fall from that bad stress into that ugly stress. So the bad stress, we all know it, that we can manage a certain amount of it, but then it's how we start to behave when we hit that danger zone, that amber zone, before we go into ugly stress. And we each have different habits that we manifest. An example I often use is of bursting into tears because I couldn't get the lid off the tomato ketchup. Obviously, that was not about the ketchup. One of my other ones is I lose my sense of humour. And what have we got if we can't laugh? And that's a sign for me that I'm starting to move into that ugly stress area. So if you're brave enough, if you could just share, just for a moment, what your well-being tells are. What happens to you when you are starting to move from that bad stress into that ugly stress? So Mrs. Swan gets snappy and short, and I know a lot of people who do that, and I do as well, actually. And I hadn't realised actually the impact it could potentially have on others. And once I was able to explain why I was snappy, that actually helped a lot to be able to be transparent about it. Yes. I'll just give it another 30 seconds. I'd quite like to know what a little bit scary means, Andy, but we'll explore that when we've got more time. And then the tearfulness, yes. I mean, I made the mistake as a middle leader, which I still say is the hardest job in a school, of asking my team via a survey what they really thought of me. Don't do that. Or if you do it in a certain way, plan it strategically. And the tears, having to actually go and hide in a cupboard, and that's so common. And stopping having those general chit chats. And my terrible year was the year when I would get home and I'd say to my husband would say, "How was your day?" And I would just shake my head. So those well-being tells are really interesting, and our activity that we will do in the full session is actually to think about those in colleagues and how we identify them, and then what we do as a result, practical stuff that we can do. And quite a nice activity, depending on the strength of relationships, is to actually take teams and get them to identify one another's well-being tells, which can be both quite poignant and slightly sensitive, but it can also be very, very funny at times, finding out what people. So I say the word right, and it drives everybody insane. So those are some of the well-being tells. Now, this next model is the least academic in the whole presentation. It's really simplistic, but it is really powerful, and it comes back to that that shape of the school year, which I alluded to earlier, which I admitted to never really having thought about. And again, I'd made the same mistakes every single year, you know, and middle of September, absolutely shattered, couldn't string a sentence together on a Friday. November, trying to make big decisions about my career. And I always now say to people, please avoid making any significant decisions about your life or work in November. Wait until February if you possibly can, because everything seems grim for most of us, many of us, in November. And we know that seasonal affective disorder is a thing. And often we find ourselves stuck in a building or stuck in a car and literally not seeing daylight, to the point where I had one colleague who was suffering from vitamin D deficiency. And at this stage in the full session, what I will ask people to do is actually bring along a 12-month calendar, and actually to map out, and I'll talk about this in more detail when we do the full session, but actually map out in your year when the highest stress, highest risk periods are for you as a professional. So for example, I'm thinking about in ordinary years, that period between sort of March and May, when people start possibly resigning, moving on, you have to get new staff in. We know that in many areas we've still got staff shortages, so that period might be particularly stressful. For me as a head of English, until very recently, you know, it was that period after the mocks when the results came in, and you have to take a deep breath and try not to burst into tears and panic and resign on the spot and get those students to where they need to be. So it's different for everybody depending on the shape of their subject and the nature of the demands. And then to actually plan that year ahead as far as humanly possible for your personal life, your personal self, tautology, you know what I mean, where you actually identify those parts of the year which you know are difficult for you. So for many people, December is actually a really difficult period. There are others who might have anniversaries of bereavements, breaks, you might have an impending house move. So there are all these things that happen in life, and having that visually for yourself is really powerful, because it allows you to, and this is that theme of control, to take back that control and say actually to your deputy or a trusted colleague, actually this is the period when I'm not going to be saying yes to any new initiatives from the DfE. This is the period when I'm going to actually delegate some of those difficult conversations to you, and really taking control of it and planning ahead. So that activity is one we will do in the full session. And then we think about perspective and dealing with setbacks. Now, I want to allude very briefly here to a wonderful book by a palliative care nurse called Bronnie Ware, W-A-R-E, and it's called The 5 Regrets of the Dying. Now, that sounds quite morbid and is potentially a very sensitive subject. But it's my colleague Adrian Bethune who alerted me to this book, and it's extraordinarily powerful, because what she does is she speaks to people who know they're going to die and asks them about their regrets. And these include things like spending too much time at work. I'm not kidding there. Spending too much time at work, not being true to your own values, not being true to yourself, not being braver, bolder about what you truly believe. And also, interestingly, keeping in touch with old friends. And the first time I had this presented to me, I actually went home and contacted some old friends that I've been meaning to contact for months. And that might be a pledge you want to consider for yourself. And then we'll go through in the full session some real practical strategies for dealing with setbacks and gaining perspective when things seem really insurmountable. So there is the good old-fashioned counting to 10 or 100 or 1,000 or whatever you need. At my PRU, we have a pause button on the wall for staff and students, so that when we hit that reptilian flight or flight zone, we actually look at that pause button, we highlight it to one another, and we stop when we count to 10. Alongside that, we have the helicopter. I found myself using to helicopter as a verb the other day, which was horrendous. I'm an English teacher, but you know, I was overwhelmed by things to do, and I said to my line manager, so I just need to helicopter this. So helicoptering is just, verb. The helicopter effect is when you just literally zoom out and you look at what is most important, because I think often we lose sight of that. And my example of that is of data and data crunching, and desperately chasing grade 4s and grade 5s, and as head of English sitting in an office going through data for students when actually the students themselves were physically sitting in a classroom, an English classroom, with a supply teacher when I should have been teaching there. We'd lost sight of what mattered. Thinking about collaboration, and the collaboration in the next session, the full session, will be one of the most powerful things. Who can I collaborate with? Is it a trusted deputy? Is it a head teacher down the road who I may have linked with during lockdown? What do I want to get out of this? Will it matter in 5 years? What have I learned? And journaling. So these are some practical strategies which we will try out in the longer session. So moving towards the end of the presentation now, this is one model of the many models of what actually supports well-being, and the different facets of what makes up well-being: mental, spiritual and emotional. And at this point in the full session, we'll look at people actually thinking actively about whether it's doing Sudoku puzzles to keep yourself mentally, or reading trashy novels to keep yourself mentally engaged but not thinking about work. Spiritual doesn't necessarily mean religion. It's about that sense of purpose, that sense of meaning. Your emotional well-being, you know, what are you doing to nourish yourself? And that tends to be the most neglected of all. And also physical. You know, Andy and I are both doing Couch to 5K. He is way ahead of me, but those things we can actively do. And then I just want to give you a snapshot of an absolutely brilliant activity that we do in the full session, which is a more complex view of well-being. And this comes out looking a bit like a spider web. And this looks at 8 much more complex nuanced elements of well-being, and it gets you to actually score yourself on a scale of 0 to 10 in each of these areas: environmental, emotional, financial, and so on, of where you feel you are in terms of your well-being, which in turn creates a shape. And you can actually see where you are. And this changes, obviously. You can do this constantly from week to week, month to month, and it changes constantly. And then thinking about where you want to be. Realistically, practically, SMART targets, however you want to think of it, and practical steps you can take to get from one place to another. So to end, and to give us this zooming tour of what would normally be a 3-hour session, I would like you to now, please, and write it down, pick up a pen, make one commitment to yourself, not your team today, not today, because actually when we talk about head teacher wellbeing and head teachers looking out for their staff, what we're really doing is getting you to look out for yourselves first and foremost. So one commitment that you are going to make for yourself, please write it down. If you would like to, it would be powerful if you could share it on the chat box, please. So you've told us you're going to do it. I'm telling you I'm going to finish Couch to 5K. There you go. It's a way of making yourself do it. So one change that you will commit to. And I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that. I think we did start a couple of minutes late, so we've got about 3 minutes. So I think this one's having lunch. How many times have we gone through a school day and found ourselves feeling a bit lightheaded at 4 o'clock and realised we haven't actually eaten anything all day? This is what I'm talking about, that basic physical needs that we tend to neglect. Stay calm, continue losing weight, respect you, Mrs. Swan. I need to follow in your footsteps. And Andy's going to run a 10K in November. He's now told all of us today, so we can hold him to account for that. So one commitment to yourself that you will stick with. And in the full session, we'll talk about commitment to your teams as well, and thinking about those different characters and particularly that unique context that you are in. So I think Andy's going to finish it off in a minute. I just want to remind you of the elements of the full session. Now, this evolves constantly. So if you could give us your feedback at education support, we will shape that session according to what you feel would be most useful to you and your teams. And obviously you'll receive this presentation so you can have a look at this. So we have an evaluation survey here, which we would really appreciate you filling in. And I will hand back over to Andy.
Thank you very much, Emma. Yes, thank you. I realised I think I was commenting just to panellists rather than the panellists and all attendees, so not everybody got that. But yes, I am committed to running 10K in November. I did Couch to 5K, sort of started in end of May time and finished that in June. So it can be done because I can do it, and I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I'm in my 6th decade, let's put it that way, so it is possible. The downside of that, though, I thought that would help me lose weight. I actually put weight on because you build up muscle.
Oh.
So it's, if you're trying to lose weight, that's probably not the way to go. But there you go. Can't have everything, can you? I'd like to say thank you to Emma. It's for carrying us through there, and thank you for people for participating as we go along. I mean, I just think it's so important to concentrate on your well-being, and to, as I think you said, Emma, just to say publicly, this is what I'm going to do. It's easy to say you're going to do things, and the road to hell is paved with good intentions, isn't it? So that's been a really helpful taster of what we can expect on the course. You sort of given us hints along the way of what next Thursday will be like. So you're going through these topics in more depth, more breakout sessions. How's that going to feel, Emma?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of this as the bones, the 24th will be the meat on the bones. So as I've alluded to it, we're going to go into a lot more depth with some of those models, but really the focus will be thinking about each of your unique contexts, because there's no one size fits all. Things we'll look at that we haven't had a chance to look at today are things like thinking traps, victimization, I got it right earlier, catastrophizing. I was going to say catastrophization. So those thinking traps and how actually we each fall into them without realizing it. We're going to do the spiderweb activity we'll spend a lot of time on that, actually about 20 minutes on that, because that I found incredibly powerful. I've done it now 4 times. But also there are sections on workload and vocation and agency and perspective that I want to unpick in a lot more detail. So agency, what is it? Why is it important? How can we actually increase our sense of control over what we do? Perspective, going into more detail about those 5 regrets and how we can actually really use that helicopter view to step back. So I will look in detail at that feedback actually, and make sure that I mean, as I said to you earlier, Andy, I can talk about this stuff all day. So so it's whatever elements people feel will be most useful, but a lot more depth.
You can't talk about it all day because people have committed to spending 15 minutes having lunch. It's 1:05, and they'll start throwing things at you in a virtual sense. So,
exactly.
Yeah, and I'm keen not to keep people away from the classroom or indeed their lunch break or whatever.
No, I won't talk about it all day. Don't worry. I just could. If you call me, I will.
I think the important take on there is knowing what you can control in your life, and like you say, it's more than you think. But be aware of what you have got agency over and can control. And learn to manage things that you don't have any control over, and don't worry that you don't have control over them. That's how life is, but control the things that you can.
Yes.
And increase the size of your inner concentric circle.
Yes, indeed.
And make your fried egg look bigger. Anyway, all right. Thank you for that, Emma. More of this next Thursday, which we look forward to people joining us. As I said at the top of this, we will copy these slides around to people. We film these presentations and we'll copy those around. So there's an aid memoir for you. If you've got colleagues you think might benefit or would want to come along, please encourage them to do so. You can find details of this course and many others on the NHT website or through Eventbrite. We've got a poll up now in front of me, so if you can feed back to us how you found it today, that'd be really helpful, because that helps us in future planning and deciding where we go. I think that's probably all I'm going to say in terms of that. So thank you, Emma. If you've got any questions about our training overall here at NHT, you want to email us. Can't speak today. Email us. You can do so at events@nht.org.uk. There was a slide at the top of the show about NHT's Wellness and Protect service, which is available to support wellbeing of all staff, and there's more details about that on our website. If you're interested in HT membership or in tailored training in terms of packaging training that we can put together for you to help you find your way through, please contact us at events@nht.org.uk. And just a quick plug for some things coming up. I know people are drifting away to their lunch, but we've got another one of these webinars in 2 weeks' time, looking at Ofsted, and the following week a preview of our early years and primary conference. And then we've got a range of courses on appraisals and difficult conversations, and PSHE, Executive Headship Curriculum Design, coming up. So keeping ourselves very busy. And over on Pathway on next Thursday, the 17th, was it this Thursday? This Thursday, the 17th, Andrew Hammond will be talking about the new Pathway programme, so you can find out more about what's in store there and then on Thursday. So I think that's enough for me. Thank you, Emma, for being with us twice this morning. Once in the morning, once in the afternoon, if you prefer. I've learned a lot. I've learned a bit about myself. I've shared a bit of myself, probably too much, but I overshare. I know I'm guilty of that. So thank you for your time. We'll see you again next Thursday, and thank you for everyone for participating.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Cheers. Thanks. Bye now.